All right, now we are discussing Alice B. Sheldon. And the work of hers that we read is The Women Men Don't See. It's a short story. And another later 20th century offering. If you look at the written out lecture, you will see a lovely photo of Alice B. Sheldon. Description on it. Let's see if I can read what this says. However, did I get on? Oof, can't quite read it. BC or huh, or can't tell what it says before something. Oh, before Charles. That's it. Sorry. To thing from I can't read it. Maybe you guys can read it. Maybe you have better eyes than I do. Anyway, it's a photo of her. She's got her hair. It looks very traditional, like let's say like late 1950s, early 1960s style for a woman. Although it's hard to know how old she was in that photo, right? Although maybe there's a date. It might be 1982 on it. I can't quite read that. But women sometimes they get their hair done, styled in a certain way, and they stick with that for a long time. So could be from that era. She's got a button-down shirt with a collar, so they're pretty standard shirt for what we would wear nowadays. Clearly could have been from the 1980s, but she did die in 1987 at 71, so I would say she looks younger than that here. I don't know. It's hard to tell. Have to do more sleuthing on that. All right, if you look at the right now lecture, you will also see a link to a New York Times review of a biography about Alice B. Sheldon called James Tiptree Jr., The Double Life of Alice B. Sheldon by Julie Phillips. There's also a Washington Post review of the aforementioned biography of Alice B. Sheldon. But this article's title is actually a clever riff on the short story of Sheldon's that we read for class this week, The Women Men Didn't See. So the article is called The Women Men Didn't See, and her short story is The Women Men Don't See. See? You get it? You see what they did there? Yeah. All right. Well, there's also the James Tiptree Jr. Website with links to extensive biographical and literary information, and a YouTube, or not a YouTube, but an audio version of an intriguing NPR segment on Alice B. Sheldon. Alice B. Sheldon is an American, or was an American, I should say. She lived from 1915 until 1987. So, until about 71 years of age, when she and her husband died, this is very sad, in a suicide pact. Yeah. Don't hear about that too often, but apparently, while she and her husband lay in bed, she shot him. He was an Alzheimer's patient, and then she shot herself. They left suicide notes describing the pact, although she had written her suicide note years before and had saved it, quote unquote, until needed. Yeah, that is quoted of her in the anthology. This grim ending perhaps embodied the quote, bleak and fatalistic unquote threads running through much of Alice B. Sheldon's science fiction, both novel and short story, for which she was awarded both of science fiction's top honors, the Hugo and the Nebula Awards. So yeah, those are famous awards, the Hugo Award and the Nebula Award, given out for her science fiction writing. And Alice B. Sheldon won both of them. Alice herself was the daughter of another popular author of mainstay fiction, Mary Hastings Bradley. So interesting. Her mother was also a popular author. Her father was a lawyer turned safari expeditionist. Kind of interesting. Who went on safari. And Alice accompanied her parents on African safaris. She was born in Chicago, Illinois, but traveled the world with her parents early on and later worked as an art critic for the Chicago Sun newspaper. She was married to William Davey from 1934 to 1941. in 1942 during World War II, she actually joined the Army and served in its photo intelligence group. In 1945, she married her second husband, Huntington Sheldon. She was discharged from the Army in the aftermath of World War II, so she and her husband formed a small business together. She also started writing fiction. In 1946, her first short story, called The Lucky Ones, was published in the highly prestigious literary magazine The New Yorker. You may know that one. It's still published today in The New Yorker. Very famous and very prestigious for having something popular, or something published in that. Yeah. From 1952 to 1955, Alice and her husband both worked for the CIA. So talk about an interesting career. That's reminding me of Aphra Behn. Remember Aphra Behn back in the 1600s worked as a spy, and here we have Alice B. Sheldon working for the CIA. But she resigned to pursue college. She earned a Bachelor's of Arts degree from American University and then a doctorate from George Washington in 1967. All right. At this point, Alice was unsure what to do with her life and new degrees, so she started writing fiction. After completing her dissertation on animal stimuli, so that's kind of an interesting departure, right? To do a dissertation, which is what you write for your PhD, on animal stimuli and then turn to fiction, right? But she turned to science fiction. So science fiction, she incorporated her interest in science there. So that creative and unusual background maybe melded together in fiction writing, science fiction writing in particular. Wanting to preserve her identity and be more accepted in the science fiction world, Alice B. Sheldon actually chose a male pseudonym, James Tiptree Jr. Now, we haven't been hearing of women authors feeling the need so much in the 20th century to use a male pseudonym, but Alice B. Sheldon did do that here, and I think it is in part, or mainly, because she wrote in science fiction, and science fiction tended to be, at least during the 20th century, more of a genre read by males and written and dominated by males. Although there are, of course, many famous female science fiction authors, especially moving forward, right? There's Ursula Le Guin, Octavia Butler, both of whom we're studying in this class. Of course, way back when we had Mary Shelley, who many will consider having kicked off the science fiction genre. So now we have Alice B. Sheldon here in, the 60s, 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, writing science fiction, but feeling as if she needed that male pseudonym to be taken more seriously, so that people would read her work. So she chose James Tiptree Jr. Interesting, she chose Jr., right? Like, I don't know if that made her feel as if she had more prestige. And her mother also was a popular author, so I do think that's even more interesting that she chose a male pseudonym and called herself a junior, maybe thinking junior because, like, my mom also is a writer, right? So junior to her mother, the famous writer. She says, quote, a male name seemed like good camouflage. I had the feeling that a man would slip by less observed. I've had too many experiences in my life of being the first woman in some darned occupation, unquote. Alice quickly became quite a popular science fiction writer, and as such, she had to answer biographical questions for the press. She always answered with accurate details from her life, but never said anything about her gender. So she camouflaged. I guess she said, she just didn't want to have as much scrutiny, right, on her. And as a famous writer, you do, right? So I guess she thought if she were a famous female writer, she'd have even more scrutiny. Alice's life on an African safari in Army intelligence with the CIA and a PhD in experimental psychology all sounded like a very traditional male background, for the times, at least. So people just assumed she was a man. so she didn't have to answer too many pressing questions, challenging whether she was a woman. Somehow, a rumor started that James Tiptree was really a woman because the author never appeared in public. There you go. However, numerous writers at the time argued vehemently that Tiptree's writings were clearly male-based, as well as Tiptree's biography, so could not have been the product of a female. For instance, in his introduction to Warm Worlds and Otherwise, writer Robert Sheldon argued, quote, "It has been suggested that Tiptree is female, a theory that I find absurd, for there is to me something ineluctably masculine about Tiptree's writing," unquote. That's quoted in our anthology. I think that is just the funniest quote, in addition to the fact that there was this rumor started and quelled by people saying, oh, her writings sound way too masculine to be written by a female. So what do they consider, the traits that would mark female work versus a male work? That's something to think about when you read her short story this week, right? What would make you think it was written by a male? What would make you think it was written by a female? Is there anything? Yeah. So think about that as you read her short story. Even acclaimed science fiction writer Harlan Ellison, in an introduction to his, again, Dangerous Visions anthology of science fiction short stories, asserted, quote, "Kate Wilhelm is the woman to meet this year, but Tiptree is the man," unquote. So in other words, if you're a science fiction author and you're a female, you want to beat Kate, either Wilhelm or Wilhelm. But if you're a man and you're a science fiction writer, your competition is James Tiptree. So that's kind of funny too. Because Harlan Ellison himself was another male science fiction author. Also could not tell if she was a man, right? In 1976, however, the cat was let out of the bag when Alice's mother died. Tiptree mentioned that his/her mother, a famous novelist, had died in Chicago, and readers found Mary Hastings Bradley's obituary, which mentioned her surviving daughter, writer Alice B. Sheldon, and by the process of deduction, these readers figured out that Sheldon was really Tiptree. Much astonishment ensued. Sheldon also wrote under the pseudonym Raccoon Sheldon. I wonder if anybody thought she was an animal. Raccoon. Yeah. Funny. She wrote her PhD, too, on animal stimuli. Anyway, probably why she chose the name. She still continued to be acclaimed and win top science fiction honors, even though the cat was out of the bag, people knew she was a woman. The work we read for class, The Women Men Don't See, was published in 1973, and it's written from the perspective of a hard-boiled male narrator. So maybe that's one part of the traits that made people think, oh yeah, she's a male, of course. Of course, like, sometimes you don't question the male name, right? When you hear the male name, you receive it as, yes, it's a male author. But then that hard-boiled male narrator also probably contributes to that sense as well of maleness about it. But it does present the female situation and feminist notions through female characters. All right, so there you go. That could have been a tip-off, right? If you're reading carefully for that. Of course, people merely noted that Tiptree was unusually feminist for a male. So, yeah, I guess they had a way of attributing that. Well, enjoy reading more about Alice B. Sheldon in our anthology. Quite an intriguing personality. And the short story of hers we read for class this week, The Women Men Don't See. Another really symbolic title, right, for our class of women's literature, because how long did we see men not seeing women, right? Like, you couldn't even find women writers in the Old English period, and not because there probably weren't any, but because people didn't write down the authors' names. A lot of things were published anonymously. Also, there was a lot of lack of education, right, and little writing. So not a lot was preserved probably on the from a female, right?